Commercial aviation was still relatively young when the Second World War ended, but it developed quickly owing to the development of aircraft technologies and construction of airfields during the war. It was so new, in fact, that when in 1948 the first attempt was made to hijack a commercial airliner in flight, the term hijack hadn't even yet been coined. Instead, they called these criminals air pirates. Today, the two densely populated harbor cities of Hong Kong and Macau were both administrative districts of the People's Republic of China. Just 40 miles, around 66 kilometers apart, travel between the two is done either by ferry or by the Hong Kong Zhuhai Macau Bridge, completed in 2018. The situation was different in 1948. Hong Kong at the time was a crown colony of Britain, and Macau was a province of Portugal. Travel between the two was conducted by boat or ferry. There was no regular air service between the two prior to 1948. But an international convention would lead Cathay Airlines to open a service. Cathay Pacific Airlines had been started in 1946 by Australian pilot Sydney Sid DeCancel and American pilot Roy Farrell. Both had been military pilots flying the difficult route between India and China over the Himalayas called the Hump. The airline initially operated Douglas DC-3 aircraft. The DC, short for Douglas Commercial 3, had been in operation since 1936 and had revolutionized commercial air travel. Huge numbers were built and used during the Second World War under various designations, including the C-47 Skytrain, of which more than 10,000 were built. Cathay Pacific's first aircraft, called Betsy, was converted from a C-47. Cathay Pacific flew routes between Hong Kong, Sydney, Manila, Singapore, Shanghai, Saigon, and Bangkok. But Cathay Pacific did not initially serve Macau. The 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement would change that. The agreement between 44 nations has been described as the first fully negotiated monetary order intended to govern monetary relations among independent states. The goal had been to rebuild the international economic system after the war, although it was negotiated while the war was still being fought. Central to the agreement was that parties would guarantee that their currency would be convertible into U.S. dollars, which themselves would be convertible into gold bullion. As a consequence, signatories agreed to ban the free trade of gold. As the UK was a signator, that meant that the free trade in gold would have to end in Hong Kong by 1958. In his 1990 book Beyond Lion Rock, The Story of Cathay Pacific Airways, travel journalist Gavin Young explained that Roy Farrell saw opportunity. Portugal was not a party to the Bretton Woods Accords and thus not subject to its limitations. He reasoned that wealthy people would have reason to take gold into Macau and that his airline could make quite good money facilitating that. It was a short jump from Hong Kong, where the airline already operated, to Macau, and Young writes that Sid, also enthusiastic about the idea, opined, "The shortest hauls pay best." Thus the two created a charter company, the Macau Air Transport Company, or Matco, and obtained a license in Macau to import gold. But there was a problem, Young explains. Macau, a mole on China's cheek so tiny as to make Hong Kong look like a great wen, had no airstrip. There was no place for Cathay Pacific's DC-3s to set down. An initial idea, just to throw bags of gold out over the Macau racetrack, proved impractical, as Young writes. The heavy barrels of gold disappeared into several feet of Macau mud. The next plan was to have the racetrack cleared to land aircraft. While permission was easily obtained via political connections, the problem was the height and proximity of the seawall. In the inaugural flight, piloted by Pinky Wan and Sid, with, Young writes, all the slapstick dignity and meticulous execution of the Marx Brothers in Animal Crackers, the landing struts clipped the seawall, forcing Pinky to belly land with no landing gear. Finally, they came to a new plan. Sid was familiar with a local service in Manila called Amphibian Airways that used flying boats to bring fresh fish to Manila from the provinces. Sid went to Manila and acquired two of their planes. These planes were Canadian Vickers Amphibians, a Canadian-built version of the consolidated Catalina PBY. The 63-foot-long, 104-foot wingspan planes could land on both land and water. Owned by Cathay Pacific and chartered by Matco, Young notes, these graceful snub-nosed amphibians with the two large overhead engines carried passengers and gold from Hong Kong to Macau. Gold that had been shipped from South Africa, the United States, Great Britain, France, and elsewhere to Hong Kong by the giants Pan American, World Airways, BOAC, Air France, and KLM, who were all prevented from flying to Macau by lack of airfields. The airline flew 2 trips a day between Hong Kong Airport and the Macau Seadrome. These were short trips, only 20 minutes each way, and as such they were called cigarette flights. That was not just that you could, of course, then smoke on flights, but because the trip was so short, it took about the same time that it takes to smoke a cigarette. Given the nature of the trade, the outbound flight to Macau often carried large amounts of gold, and wealthy people frequented the flights. One of the 2 planes was named Miss Macau. It used the spelling Macao rather than the standard Macau spelling used today. Purchased in the Philippines, the plane was converted for passenger service, configured to carry 24 passengers, between October and November of 1947, and began charter service between Hong Kong and Macau in April of 1948. On July 16, 1948, the morning flights had been flown without problem, and the evening flight took off from Hong Kong at around 5:30 p.m. local time. The pilot was Dale Kramer, an experienced American pilot who had flown Catalinas with the U.S. Navy's Patrol Squadron 45 during the war. Also qualified to fly the DC-3, he had left the Navy in early 1947 and had been employed by Cathay Air since August of that year. The co-pilot was an Australian, K.S. Macduff. An official report says that the departure from Hong Kong Airport was recorded by Aerodrome Control. The plane was flying its normal route at about 1,000 feet in good weather conditions. It was observed by the duty controller for 5 minutes and then passed out of sight. The flight time to Macau was assumed to be around 30 minutes, followed by a brief turnaround before returning to Hong Kong. Hong Kong received no signal regarding landing or takeoff in Macau, but that was not considered to be unusual. However, by 7:30, when the plane had not returned to Hong Kong, it was assumed to be overdue. Hong Kong broadcast calls on the international distress frequency with no response. Unable to make radio contact with Macau to confirm whether the plane had taken off, the Hong Kong Aerodrome contacted the Hong Kong Water Police and Chinese Maritime Customs to have their patrol vessels look out for the aircraft. While the 2 were having trouble making radio contact, which was a common issue, Young writes these were the days when communications were primitive even across short distances. At Macau, the plane had landed and taken off on schedule with 23 passengers, Kramer and Macduff, flight hostess D. DaCosta, and Mr. R. Frost, the airline's Hong Kong traffic manager. Young writes that Frost, at the last moment, had asked if he might come along for the ride, to kill time, actually, while his wife was having her hair done. Everything seemed normal until 9:30 that evening, when the Macau Seadrome operator was notified by Macau police that a fishing boat had rescued a survivor and brought them to Macau. Macau was not able to make radio contact with Hong Kong until the following morning, when they confirmed the loss of the aircraft. Young says of the survivor that he was a half-drowned Chinese, still breathing but incapable of speech. Police swiftly identified him in hospital as one Wong Yu, a 24-year-old rice farmer from Nam Mun. For the moment, he could tell them nothing. The fisherman who had rescued the survivor, it turns out, had witnessed the crash, saying that the plane had flown over his boat before making a sharp turn to the left, and then a sharp turn to the right, and crashing directly into the sea, followed by an explosion. A second witness in a boat approximately 8 miles away gave a similar report, except that he didn't recall hearing an explosion. Neither could give an exact time of the crash, but it appeared to be shortly after Miss Macau had flown out of the sight of the Macau controller. On the 18th, the fisherman was able to take authorities to the approximate location of the crash, where fishing junks with drags were able to locate the wreckage. On the 19th, the Australian newspaper, the Kalgoorlie Daily Miner, reported that Macduff and Frost, both Australians, appeared to have been lost, and that a search for other survivors has so far proven fruitless. They noted that one body, that of Mr. G. H. Stewart, an assistant district manager for the Texas Oil Company, had been recovered. The recovery operation found, the official accident report said, that it was obvious from the commencement of the operation that the aircraft had struck the water with very high speed. While the plane was completely collapsed the whole length, there was no sign of fire or explosion. The report notes examination of the aircraft controls and instruments showed the engine throttles were in normal cruising position, and the mixture controls in the engineer's compartment were in the fully rich position. All switches were in normal positions, indicating that the aircraft had been cruising normally. While more bodies were found, oddly one particular feature was that the body of the first officer was comparatively uninjured, which indicates that he could not have been in the co-pilot seat at the time of the impact, as the pilot's compartment was completely smashed. Still, Young writes, that did nothing to explain why Miss Macau dropped out of the sky. There was no sign of fire or explosion. Everything looked as if the plane had been flying normally. What on earth had happened? But the wreckage started to tell a story. Once the main compartment was raised, a number of bullets and shell casings from .38 caliber and .45 caliber ammunition were discovered. The plane appeared to have suffered an armed attack. To be precise, Young writes, Miss Macau was the victim of the first act of piracy for gain in the history of aviation. The China Mail, an English-language newspaper in Hong Kong, described the event as unparalleled in the history of aviation. Suspicion immediately fell upon the lone survivor. Young writes that the Macau detective force went to imaginative lengths to get a confession. Knowing that Wang Yu would be unlikely to confess, they instead had detectives disguised as patients placed in the neighboring beds. Over time, Wu told them the story. The Associated Press reported, bungling, trigger-happy Chinese pirates were blamed today for the July 16th crash of a huge flying boat, which cost 25 lives, including those of 7 Americans. Wang Yu said 2 friends, Chu Tok, a former Catalina flyer from Manila, and Chu Yat Yang, visited him and asked if he was interested in some work. I was in such a bad financial condition, I accepted. Eventually, another conspirator, a relative of Chu Tok and Chu Yat, named Chu Chung, was brought in as well. Time magazine wrote in their August 9, 1948 edition, in a Macau tea house, Wang Yu and a few of his friends decided to sell their rice paddies and take up piracy. From selling property, they obtained $3,000, which they used, the AP writes, to obtain pistols and westernized clothing. The AP continues that the pirates were gambling that robbery and ransom of the passengers would be profitable. They apparently had no knowledge that 4 Chinese millionaires were aboard the flight that they had selected, and that one had a huge sum of money on his person, estimated by his widow to be as much as $125,000. Time writes, the Catalina skimmed above the calm waters and set its course for Hong Kong. Below, off 9 islands, a scattered fleet of fishing junks spread their lug sails against the sky. Chu Tok moved forward, ordered senior pilot Kramer to surrender control. But the plan quickly went wrong. The AP reports, one of the white passengers tried to interfere, and co-pilot K.S. McDuff struck at Chu Tok with the plane's metal flagstaff. All 3 of the Chus opened fire. Several bullets struck Kramer in the back. He slumped over the controls. The flying boat began a curving dive towards the sea with its cargo of screaming, panic-mad passengers. The plane fell from an altitude of 500 feet, carrying to their deaths all except Wang, who leaped from a window and was later picked up by a junk. Wang Wu's fate was frankly bizarre. Time reported, since the Catalina flew the British flag, Wang Yu would be tried in Hong Kong. Since piracy laws don't yet cover air piracy, he will probably be charged with simple murder. But, Young writes, the legal aftermath was something of a farce. The self-confessed pirate was never tried for murder or piracy, since the British considered his evidence inadmissible in a Hong Kong court, and the Portuguese authorities took the position that they had no jurisdiction over piratical acts on a British plane. After 2 years of legal wrangling, in 1951, Wang was simply let go, without having been tried. Now, you can choose to believe or not believe in something called karma, but Roy Farrell later found out from a Chinese friend that Wang, who never faced trial for his crimes, was actually released from prison on the night of a fairly powerful typhoon. Apparently, he was struck by flying debris and killed not 2 blocks from the prison gate. The first instance of air piracy, the thing that would be called hijacking, would be reason enough to remember the story of the Miss Macau, but it had a larger impact on commercial aviation that still impacts us today. Prior to this act, there was very little security required to get on an airplane, but owing to this act of air piracy, the Hong Kong airport started subjecting travelers to a technology that had developed during the Second World War: metal detecting. The long and still continuing struggle between authorities who are looking for ways to prevent hijackers from getting on board airplanes and the criminals trying to innovate ways around those procedures had begun. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community and locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.